Welcome to the Making Sense of MarTech. I'm Jacqueline Friedman. Let's go down the rabbit hole together. Sarah Gallardo has spent over 12 years crafting email campaigns for Fortune 500 companies. And she's become one of the industry's fiercest advocates for accessibility. Not because it's legally required, but because she's watched companies leave billions on the table by ignoring it. Here's what doesn't make sense to me. 77% of brands claim they prioritize email accessibility, yet only 8% actually follow best practices. That is not a gap, that's a chasm. And she has been in the trenches of enterprise marketing tech, watching this disconnect play out daily. The industry we're in talks a lot about inclusion while systematically designing experiences that lock out 1.3 billion disabled people worldwide. People who collectively control over 1 trillion in annual disposable income. It's mind-boggling, but let me introduce Sarah real quick. She is the Associate Principal Technical Producer at Stitch, specializing in email accessibility after her more than 12 years building high-performing email campaigns at Oracle and Epsilon. Casual. And she also earned her CPA-CC, which is a Certified Professional in Accessibility Core Competencies in 2020, which is a certification demonstrating foundational knowledge of digital accessibility. She also became a trusted tester in 2023, meaning she is certified to test websites and software for accessibility in accordance with official standards. Her accessibility journey began in 2014 when her youngest child was diagnosed with dyslexia. And that experience led her through advocacy work and revealed uncomfortable parallels between educational and digital accessibility barriers. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited about being here.
Me too. All right, I want to dive in with you. So let's start with some quick rapid fires. What was your first MarTech tool?
As a developer, I really don't do a lot in actual tools, which feels scandalous to say out loud. But so technically my first tool was Dreamweaver.
Love Dreamweaver, still to this day. Yeah, I don't know why Dreamweaver gets so much. It's excellent for email. One of your children's diagnoses changed your career path forever. How did advocating for them change your perspective at work?
So it really wasn't until I started having conversations with like coworkers and directors and executives, clients, where I would bring up accessibility and they'd kind of be like, oh, that doesn't really matter in email, and just kind of like sweep it over the rug, or they'd have all these assumptions, especially like well, that's what the viewing browser is for. They'd have these like all these myths that were built up. And I would just be like, is that true? Like, who says that that's true? You know what I mean? And
That's
so there was just,
infuriating.
yeah, like there's just a lot of the stuff that I started then doing the research and then being able to say, actually, push those glasses back. But it felt so much like attending IEP meetings where my kids' teacher is like, they're not doing their homework because they're lazy. And I'm like, no, that's not the issue. I know this kid, they're not lazy. But like just all these kind of mismatches between what I think is true and what is actually true just became really hard to ignore.
Without a doubt. And that core misunderstanding is not only frustrating, I would imagine, as a parent, but also as the child. And seeing an industry and all the industries not paying attention in the right way. At least in America, the ADA, American Disability Act, is important and kind of going against the law if you don't do it correctly.
It really is. And there's a lot moving on that subject right now, but I do think the underlying core is that our emails need to be accessible for much more than just legal reasons, but I'm sure we'll get more into that later. But there's so much built into it that just makes it what it should be is just an automatic yes.
Without a doubt. Okay, I'm going to ask you a spicy question. What is the most inaccessible email you've received from a major brand recently?
It is always retail. I personally try not to name brands because I feel like it's not respecting the journey of the marketing team. Part of the job is to advocate for that, to get them to understand that it's an issue, part of why I'm here, right? But so many retail brands are all images, and then they have all these linked images without any alt text, and it's just such a giant mess. I just want to like scream it to the heavens, like, come on, guys, just some alt text. It doesn't even have to be perfect. It just has to be so much more than what you're doing right now. So that would all of the retail emails are in the trash bin for me.
That makes sense. Well, if you don't name names, I will. And top of mind for me is actually Gap. What do you think? Have you seen those emails?
I could complain so much about Gap emails, and I used to shop there all the time. I know that they're working on things, but they're all movable ink emails anymore. I think they just produce all of their emails and send them directly to movable ink to populate. And so it's all the movable ink defaults for the alt text. So it's all display images to see real-time content over and over and over and over again through the entire email. And it really makes me angry. Almost as angry as the gigantic animated GIFs that they also send that are like 30 megabytes or whatever. Awful.
Oh, goodness. Okay. Now that we've successfully found a company that has room for improvement, I would like to set the stage beyond just one company. So email in general is generating, and this is like the most well-known stat, but it's 36 to 1 ROI, and people with disabilities control over 1 trillion in annual disposable income. And so that math just doesn't add up to me. And so I want to address this elephant in the room. The business case is airtight. Why is it not working? Why are we not getting more accessibility in our emails?
I think it's on a couple of different fronts. I think the people making the decisions believe a lot of the myths that exist in our world, that the view in browser solves all accessibility, and that if you have alt text, that's all you need, kind of thing. But then I also think that it's such a fast-paced industry, trying to pull someone's ear enough to get them to listen, to get them to pay attention to, the very obvious stats that we have, the 28% of all adults have some kind of disability. All of these, the Black Friday season of 2021 lost about $121 billion because the websites were not accessible. That was kind of the estimated loss. And so there's all these good reasons, but then there's still people like me that just feel like I'm like waving my arms forever saying, hey, just do this thing. I think there's also kind of this idea that accessibility is hard or takes a tremendous amount of resources. And I really just don't think that that's true. I think it can be true if you have certain setups, but moving towards a more accessible solution also makes for a much more efficient, a much better solution for your marketing in general. It's like if you want to stay in the stone ages of email marketing, you can stay there, or you can come to the future with us and have flexible messaging and make sure that they're accessible.
Without a doubt. So for those who are just learning about how rampant this is, what are the top 3 things folks can do to at least start the process that are easy and you name it?
So the biggest one, absolute biggest, is live text. Give me your live text. I have a couple of blog posts all about the importance of live text and how it isn't just alt text that we need. Second would be having alt text on your linked images. If you do those 2 things, you will be better than most of the emails in my inbox. And then third, I would say, attempting to pursue higher learning on it, or whether that's, reading blog posts, reading through the EMC accessibility report, kind of familiarizing yourself with that. So those 2 things, quick hits, get it done. And then kind of continuing to progress that knowledge so that you're not just doing those 2 things.
I love that, because those are not hard things to do. And you don't have to be an email developer to do them either.
No, in the accessibility audits that I do at Stitch, I literally always have live text and image alt text for linked images in my presentation, just baked in. It never leaves, it never goes anywhere. It's always a problem.
Without a doubt. Okay, I want to talk about a bad offender that you've mentioned during COVID, when you received a letter from a CEO and it was entirely an image. Did you email them to tell them that it was how broken it was?
No, I didn't. In part because any of us who were sending out all of those billions of emails in March and April of 2020 know that there was no free time. I think I saw that email while I was drifting off to sleep, because I also had kids who were home doing homeschool all of a sudden, dealing with their own consequences. So no, I definitely did not reach out. I just blasted them on the internet instead.
You've told a story about inventing a drawing device for people without hands when you were 11. What is the adult equivalent of that misguided solution you see companies proposing today?
such an adorable concept. For those that don't know, I entered this project into the science fair for 5th grade, and the judge kind of very snobbily pointed out that my drawing device had handles and it was for people without hands. You can kind of see the very horrible logical fallacy of my 10-year-old self. But it happens a lot, especially in the technology sphere and especially in the accessibility space. When we're talking about accessibility overlays, they are sold all over the place. You can't Google accessibility or accessible websites and not get a million ads for these overlay companies. But accessibility professionals have pointed out over and over and over again that these absolutely do not work. They cause more problems than they solve, but they're still selling them and they're still there. And there's a whole bunch of kind of, I think people just come, I think especially now that we have all the AI stuff coming in, people come up with an idea and they think it's great and they think it solves a problem, but they don't do any of the research to actually determine what the problem is, even just whether or not the problem has already been resolved.
Without a doubt. You mean buying a new technology to build on top of my existing technology doesn't fix all my problems?
Right.
Who would have thought?
Yeah, no, I can understand the appeal. It feels so much easier, so much cheaper, but in reality, the best thing you can do is to build something to be accessible from the beginning, not
Yep.
slap an overlay over the top.
Well, I think to that point, we've, in the past 10, 15 years, are like mobile first in terms of how we're building things. It also needs to be mobile first and accessible first. And then we'll have the same rigor.
Yeah. I mean, mobile first is part of accessible first, because when you're
Yes.
building something to be mobile first, you're thinking about live text, you're thinking about how that text is reflowing in different size screens, and all of the things that I want you to think about when you're thinking about accessibility. So they're very hand in hand. So yeah, totally agree.
For sure. Okay. You've said email marketing has literally saved your butt a few times as a newly single parent during the recession. How did financial necessity shape your perspective on who deserves access to digital communications?
Oh man, I think because that time it was such a hard time for me, and trying to get a leg up anywhere was such a complicated situation for me. So I think one of the things that I have worked really hard on, just from my own perspective, is trying to make sure that that information is freely available. I learned a lot in my kind of early years from blogs that existed at the time, like Nicole Merlin's blog and let's see, Mark Robbins and Jay, like we're all kind of posting stuff and talking about how they were solving problems. And, that was a lifeline for me being a sole email developer in the dungeon basement of odd office buildings that I was working at in my early days. And I think it's so important that we, as kind of more experienced marketers, are kind of sharing those stories, sharing those kind of skills and knowledge that we have as best as we can. But I think that there's still like, generally, if someone's reaching out to me and asking me to help solve a problem, I want to be able to do that.
Yeah,
Very
I think
important.
a lot of like apprenticeship and mentorship has been
Yeah.
lost.
Yeah.
And you don't know what you don't know. And it's also
Hmm.
sometimes helpful to hear from someone who has been through it and understands what you're facing. Not as a leg up, but just as a guiding light. And
No,
it's hard to
I mean, and
find.
I think having someone who can look at it, just even look at your code and say, oh, you're missing a closing tag. Like just to give that little bit of like direction on what the problem is to be able to find it is so huge. So yeah, totally
I
agree.
agree. Okay. You've worked across all of the major platforms for enterprise marketing teams, sophisticated, particularly expensive platforms. Why is accessibility not a core feature of those platforms rather than just an add-on service, something you have to do on your own?
Man, it's so hard because it's like I think it speaks so much to the history of our own industry, right? A lot of these ESPs were built in the very beginning of our industry and were built a certain way and built by people who built emails a certain way and in order to kind of build into that, right? And so I think there's kind of a lot of archaic legacy code solutions that exist within those platforms, right? And then I think we have a lot of these newer platforms that I think are at least trying, like the Be Free editor really does a lot of good things. And that's a lot of what is in Braze as well, is there are good solutions there. But now we have some pretty substantial gaps between what they're still not doing right and being able to advocate for their users how to create accessible content within their platform that I think just doesn't exist yet. So I do think there's kind of just a lot of missing pieces that hopefully we can continue to shore up and make better and kind of call out when it's not there.
For sure. And for what it's worth, Be Free is the white labeled WYSIWYG builder for most major platforms. Not all, but a significant portion that you wouldn't always expect. I love the Be Free team, and I know they're aware of these things. And so,
yeah, I do think it's great that they're actively working on trying to solve some of this. I think that's great.
Yes, they're actively working on it, but also they're directly listening to the power users, the folks who know. And, credit should go where credit is due of at least listening, because there's a lot of platforms that it just goes into a void and you never get heard from again.
As someone who has worked really hard to try to get in front of some of the builders of some of these platforms to be like, hey, we could just make this really accessible if we solve this problem. And getting anyone to listen to you is so nearly impossible sometimes. So absolute kudos to them. Agreed.
Yes, but it's also crazy because these companies are actively losing money, not just the platforms themselves, but also the brands that are leveraging these platforms by ignoring their disabled customers. And so, basic fixes, alt text for images, why does that still require a specialist to implement? I can see where this actually is a good job for AI to be like, all right, what text is in this image, or describe this image? And so, I don't know. That's where my head goes, at least.
Not to be super nitpicky, but alt text really isn't an image description. It's a little different, but
fair.
There's a lot of nuance there. And I think there is also a lot of fear and anxiety about what it should be that I think keeps people from doing it, which is kind of silly in a number of ways because anything is better than nothing. But I think that a lot of times that kind of fear of doing it wrong, especially when we're talking about accessibility, is kind of overwhelming. And a lot of times people just want a source of truth to know that they're doing it right. It's hard to spend the time to learn how to do it right.
And I know in my years of building and developing emails, my attempt was always, all right, if there are words, just write those words. A bare minimum. I wouldn't say it's ideal, but it is a bare minimum.
But bare minimum is still more than a lot of people are doing, which is
true.
Why we keep talking about it and why it's not done yet.
And I guess actually to that point, if I'm doing the bare minimum of putting what could be live text that's from my image, that's supportive of the email, what could I do to be a step above that?
Well, I'll always say live text first.
Yes.
But I do think one-to-one is a good point. If you have text on your image, that text should be represented in the alt text as best as possible. I always want to be aware of the length of that text because most screen readers will stop reading at about 120 characters. So if you have a large block of text, that's not going to be read, right? And there's a couple of different ways to solve it. I think the kind of most efficient way would be in your alt text to kind of reword it so that you're saying the most important stuff in the beginning, so that is what is actionable and understood by the user. But I'll always continue to underline, but it's best if it's just live text because it can be.
Yeah. So you mean I shouldn't have my really pretty testimonial written all there? Instead, I should actually have it as live text.
You really should. It makes it so much easier for so many people.
Without a doubt. Okay, I want to continue talking about the tech and getting into the technical reality of what you're actually building. And so the gap between advocacy and execution. So where and how does AI provide easy shortcuts to improving accessibility, and where does it fail and flail?
I mean, there are so many things that AI does well and that I think it's continuing to do well. Absolutely, uploading an image to have it write the text for you if someone's not providing alt text is a good solution. But I'm always wary of people using AI to determine if a message is accessible because I think there is a real lack of what is programmatically available to us, what an AI or an accessibility checker can actually check versus something that a human can check. And those numbers put it at around 20 to 40% of the WCAG criteria, which means that anywhere from 60 to 80% of what you're seeing can't be quantified within a checker or AI. So, so even if you get that 100% dream parcel accessibility score, you could still have a message that is not accessible and vice versa. Even though I love the parcel guys, they do such a great job. But there is just a technical limit that AI and programmatic solutions just can't solve.
That makes sense.
Well, I can't, like, it literally can't be done by a robot or a non-human. There has to be a certain amount of humans looking at things and making sure that it works correctly.
Without a doubt.
Nobody likes it when I say that out loud, but
And it's important to say.
Brought to you by our sponsors. If there's one theme that's followed me at every stop in my MarTech career, it's trying to get good data into the hands of marketers. That's why I'm so excited to tell you about our sponsor, HighTouch, the leading composable CDP and AI decisioning platform. Companies like Domino's, Chime, Aritzia, and PetSmart trust HighTouch to power their data. And here's the kicker. 90% of customers have a real use case live in production within their first week. That means you can implement a world-class CDP in months rather than the usual years-long headache. That's why top brands choose HighTouch to personalize every customer interaction at scale. See what HighTouch can do for you at hightouch.com/MSOM. And now back to the hot seat.
Okay. You getting even more technical. You've documented how VML, which is vector markup language, the coding language behind visual email elements such as background images and buttons, can cause major accessibility failures in screen readers and Outlook 360. Always Outlook. When you audit a client's existing templates, what percentage actually pass basic accessibility standards with that?
there are definitely clients that don't use it. There's a bit of a confirmation bias there because it is a group of people that are seeking out my services. So therefore, they at least know to a certain extent that they need them. But also, I don't think that there's such thing as 100% accessible. I just don't think that that's a good goal to have. I think focusing on the things that you can do to make it more accessible is always going to be the goal for me. And that's kind of the outcome of like one of my accessibility audits is, hey, here are the things that I'm seeing. Here are some ways where I've seen that process not like fall apart. Like, how can we shore up, your alt text on your linked images so that people are getting the best possible experience? And if we can't do the best possible experience, what can we do that's, a second best? And so my goal is never to get someone to 100%. It's to get them as close to 100% as they can go and kind of hopefully lay out a plan for here's some things we can solve right now. Here are some things we can work on our process and our kind of organizational structure to get us to here. And then, here's our goal for 2 to 3 years out.
Yeah. So it kind of sounds like a pass fail. Like you can pass really well or you can pass just barely, but as long as you're passing, we're in a better place.
Well, I just always think it's a progress, not perfection kind of thing. Like,
Yeah.
I think, if I take a retail client, like one that I'm auditing right now, that is image only, they have loads of images that are linked that have no alt text.
Oh, fun.
Even their footer links are all images without appropriate alt text. It's really bad. So am I going to take them from that to a fully flexible live text everywhere email? Probably not. Like, I think that would be a wonderful goal to have, but I don't think I'm going to get there. I think I can get them to a place where, maybe we're able to move some of that to live text, and maybe we're able to get them to actively pursue alt text that is more appropriate than nothing.
Yeah.
These are all kind of incremental goals versus
like a step change every time.
Yeah, exactly. Like, as long as we're getting better. And I love that for our industry too. And I do think it is getting better, but it is a slow progress step.
Yeah. I will say I know an anecdote of a company I deeply respect who is actually in retail. And they hired a email designer who is also an email developer and essentially created a design system that they use as their source of truth and core, and that is accessible and all the things. But they take it to another level if they do use AI to help build their emails, but it has to QA up against the email design system so that it's their own customized version.
I think there's been a lot of slack in our industry about AI And I think people are kind of going at it from the wrong angle. I put this graphic into, ChatGPT or Claude and asked it to spit out an email, and it spat out trash code. And it's like, well, yeah, of course it did. But what are some ways where we can work within AI, use it as a component, use it as a tool, where we're having the AI be the kind of repository of all of these modules and being able to build it from that side instead of expecting the AI to do all of the lifting? How can we kind of incrementally work AI into our process? I think has been, well, I hope has been everyone's kind of movement over the last few years, because I think that's what we're all doing. But yeah.
That makes sense. And kind of in that same vein, with automated campaign QA that you do, how much of that QA includes accessibility testing, and what happens when accessibility requirements conflict with speed?
Always, if you do it right, accessibility shouldn't take more time, is my kind of core belief as a developer. I always try to make sure that the accessibility components, especially the on-fire ones, are called out to clients. And so I will kind of call that out as soon as I see it, especially when it's the big ones like not having alt text on linked images, color contrast, the kind of big, obvious, easy, fixable ones. And then I always try to also have a follow-up conversation, because I think in the heat of the moment, if this email was supposed to go out 3 hours ago and they keep having problems, that's not the time for me to be like, let me talk to you about 28% of our society. It's going to fall on deaf ears in that moment. But I think, being able to say, hey, I wanted to revisit an issue we had last week and kind of reflect more on calling out. I know that color contrast, because of your branding system, doesn't work here, but I really want us to kind of dig into that a little bit more and see what we can do. How is your website handling this problem, and kind of bring in more of those tools to be able to have that conversation in a more open way than in the heat of the moment, because that's never a good time.
Makes sense. And following that same vein, you were the lead email developer at Oracle. Did scale make accessibility easier or harder to implement consistently?
Oh gosh. I love this question, because it's one of those things where the answer is yes. uh, Both of these things are true, right? I think in a lot of ways, if I was a single developer for a specific company and I managed all of their emails, I could more strictly maintain and manage accessibility from start to finish, right? In bigger agencies, I think there is a bit of a problem of, and I love developers. I love all of us. We're incredibly smart people, but there's also a lot of misinformation out there about accessibility that impacts developers too. Like just even silly things like I heard a couple of years ago, someone mentioned that our clickable links, our CTAs, should have the roll button on them, an ARIA role, which is not true at all, because a link is not a button, a really big deal. So coming across, being able to kind of manage what everyone is doing to make sure that everyone is doing things that are actually accessible and not something that they just saw on a blog somewhere and didn't do any testing on and just started acquiring into their systems, definitely is a lot harder to manage. I think there's kind of just a lot of entropy that happens within systems that is hard to stay on top of. But on the flip side, I think because of my certifications and because of the research and the kind of work that I've done in our community, I do feel a certain amount of, I don't know, feeling heard when I say things that I feel like people do listen to that. And so there's a certain amount of responsibility that kind of comes with that, of being able to like, no, we're not going to do it that way. And this is why. And so you need to change it. And being able to kind of have the backing from upper leadership of kind of being like, yeah, as Sarah said, we're not doing that.
It makes sense. And I guess for those who are wanting to learn more, besides just your blog, where are reliable, trusted resources so that we can at least be going to the right places to learn more?
No, I mean, there are so many smart people talking in our space right now. I mean, gotta absolutely say Paul Airy, he's like the OG accessibility guy in our space, and he is so smart, has such a wealth of knowledge and skill that like I love his newsletter. It's amazing. Mark Robbins is another one. Obviously, his work with EMC and just from the very beginning, I think is so important. And a lot of the work that he does is just so spot on, really kind of seeing all of the problems from multiple different angles, I think is super important as well. So those would be like my top two But there is a lot of information just externally in the web space too that I think is applicable, but you definitely have to kind of do some additional work to make sure that it works, because a lot of the stuff that works in web doesn't work in email. Surprise. Kind of
Correct.
That's kind of how email works.
Yes. Okay. I want to have us take a step back and think through how our industry is drowning in good intentions and terrible execution. It's so sad. So let's talk about the real state of things. There's some caveats that I'm sure you're going to include, but only 0.1% of HTML emails currently are meeting accessibility standards. That's abysmal. And that means making your emails accessible immediately puts you ahead of 99.9% of competition. That's a pretty hefty stat. So, yet, here we are. What's the worst accessibility myth you've had to debunk in a corporate boardroom?
Alt text isn't all you need, but I would say that is kind of our biggest myth that I keep running into, where, I'll say, well, your emails aren't accessible because they're all images, right? Well, we have alt text. Okay, great. About 3% of the total population is visually impaired, and about half of those people use screen readers. So when we're talking about 28% of adults in the US that have a disability, we are not only talking about screen reader users. We are talking about the other, 25% of those people who need other things like dyslexia, right? My youngest daughter has dyslexia, and she uses a lot of plugins on her browsers to be able to help her read the content that'll change the fonts or the colors or the font size so that she can more clearly read it, right? None of those solutions work when your email is an image. So I really think that that's
true.
like one of the biggest myths that I would love to just kibosh is, like, if I could live through accessibility audits and not have someone say, but we have alt text, I would feel like I've just like entered like a new realm of the world. It just would be great.
That makes sense. And I guess to that end, are there particular fonts, because email is persnickety as to which fonts will work where and how?
Yes.
Is there a particular font or couple of fonts that we actually should focus on so that we can be that next level beyond alt text?
Absolutely. So I think there's some debate in the accessibility community around whether sans serif or serifs are better for reading. I think when we're talking about digital content, we usually point more towards sans serif, like a good clean sans serif is a good one. But I would also like to have email developers specifically actually take a step back from font choices and actually allow us, have us code messages where the user can select the fonts. So that actually means not having inline font styles, or kind of being more flexible about those inline font styles, because a lot of those plugins can override at top levels, but can't always override those inline styles. So allowing for a little less rendering strictness and a little bit more rendering flexibility so that users can change the fonts to what works for them would be my biggest suggestion. Yeah.
That's a big one that I have yet to come across. So in that respect, would the font be based off of an extension that's adjusting it for someone's browser? Or is that something you preset of, like, I just want all of my content in my inbox to be using this font? Or is it both, either or?
Well, so it's a little bit of both. So I think us as developers making sure that we're kind of setting the font more in the internal style sheet and less at, like I was saying, not so much on the inline style. And that in itself allows these plugins to come in and make some of those changes. So a lot of the dyslexia font plugin that you can put on any of your browsers will automatically change all of the text on a page to a dyslexia friendly font. But if you have your font styled inline, it's not always able to overcome that. Quite honestly, they're getting better than when I first tested it a couple years ago. We're not stagnant here. There's definitely some nuance to that, in that, obviously brands want to have their brand font and have that be available. But if a user has decided to choose something different, whether that be a plugin or changing their font preference within the email client itself, or even just globally, then their UI, making sure that we can kind of meet that as best as we can, given the limitations of our media, is what I like to say. Like, as best as we can,
Understood. And if you could have a magic wand and change one thing across all email platforms tomorrow, what would it be?
Prefers reduced motion. That would be my big one. In part because I love a good animated GIF. Like I am a true elder millennial. I love me some animated GIFs. They make me very happy.
Me too.
And especially in email, because we have so many limits on what we actually can do. An animated GIF does so much by, providing energy and motion. But as email marketers, we don't have the ability to control that the way that we do on websites. So what I mean by that is if I'm just on Firefox or Chrome, I can actually change a setting in that browser that says, I don't want my animated GIFs. Like that, makes me feel seasick, or, as someone with ADHD, I can't focus on the text because of the moving animation. So I want that animation to not play. That's something that we can do in a browser. But within an email client, we really don't have that control everywhere. And so
That's
that
true.
gets us to what is essentially a fallback solution in the WCAG of only having animated GIFs that play for 5 seconds, which is nothing, right? It makes my heart sad. I'm like, but an animated GIF should be fun and keep going. And especially a 5-second animated GIF that isn't taking up the majority of the screen. So when we're following all of the WCAG criteria, generally we even want it below the fold. 5 seconds later, that GIF isn't even playing by the time I get to it, right? So we have all these kind of fallback limitations because we don't have the ability to control those animated GIFs using that preferred reduced motion. We really have to rely on this extended fallback of not having the GIFs play for 5 seconds. And that is such a limit to us as marketers that can totally be resolved. And so I think that's on my wish list.
That'd be awesome. And for what it's worth, I feel like the most impactful GIFs are not large. They're small little accoutrements. They're more like,
not to go too far here, but
do it.
So prefers reduced motion, the WCAG criteria of pause, stop, hide, being able to pause, stop, or
Yes.
hide animations is actually in one of the top 4 most important WCAG criteria that we can meet. That even if nothing else in your email is accessible, you have to meet these requirements, right? It's a really, really, really big deal, and we can't meet it. And so, I think when I talk about animated GIFs, people are like, oh, silly little animated GIFs, it's no thing. This is actually a really, really, really big deal. And the people that are impacted by automatically looping animated GIFs are severely impacted by them. So even though in the world that we live in, it feels like a very small thing, it's actually a really big deal, which is why it's at the top of my list instead of, making everyone do live text or something.
That makes a lot of sense. And so for many marketers, a lot of what they are evaluating is like the worthiness of making certain changes, particularly based on email client usage. And they see the breakdown, and oftentimes they're apparently willing to break access for so many folks, whether it's rounded corners and just all the Outlook things. How do you have a conversation with folks about improving accessibility without completely losing them and keeping their interest?
I do try to really focus, even when I'm doing my audits, I try to stick with or focus in the very beginning on the biggest offenders. And what's nice about the biggest offenders is that I can usually show instead of tell, right? So if you have an image-based email and your linked images don't have alt text, I can play a recording of that screen reader readout and your jaw will drop. You know what I mean? So this is an easy way for me to kind of say, wow, this is a problem. A couple of weeks ago, I actually had a client who was using animated GIFs that were looping endlessly and they were very vibrant. So after making sure that everyone in the room was not going to have a reaction to this, I made a slide full of all of their animated GIFs just playing on a loop so that I'm not going to stay on the slide for long, but I want you to know what it feels like when people see these animated GIFs on your screen. If you're impacted by it, it is a very jarring experience. And so I do try to make it as relevant as possible and kind of put people into that experience. It was very common to bring a dyslexia experience kind of game that we would start out, showing the teachers, now write everything with your left hand. Like, how much more are you thinking about it? Or even we had a game where we would, do the story continuation where one person starts its story and someone else finishes it. But then you can no longer use the letter N. So the letter N can't be in any of your words. And how much more you have to think about words and the construction of words to be able to go through that process, I think is part of what I carry with me into my audits to make sure that people aren't just like, yes, this is a checklist item. We're not making it. This is how we meet it. But like, this is why this is a checklist item. This is why
Yeah.
this is important to your users. This is their experience when they're opening your absolutely beautiful email that they can't read.
And I think everyone, whether or not you experience it, having some version of experiencing it changes your perspective. And while we've been harping on this, accessibility advocates have been making these cases for years. I mean, we already talked, there's $1.2 trillion of purchasing power left in the dust, and 1 in 4 US adults live with a disability. So this, to me, the most clear ROI of what can be changed and what can be done. Why has this pressure not moved the needle?
I don't know. I think in my young, idyllic, new accessibility, Sarah, I really thought it was an information problem. And I do think there's a certain amount of information that needs to be met there. But I think that there's a status quo problem in email that I think a lot of us are kind of working to push back against. A lot of the conferences and kind of webinars that I've talked to a lot lately have been really talking about kind of pushing us past what we've always done or what's worked in the past. We live in such a completely different world now than the one we were living in 5 years ago, 10 years ago. We can't use the same metrics. So I do think that there's kind of a core misunderstanding and kind of and also a desire to not change anything because there is so much pressure right now. So those are my big thoughts. I'm always happy to see that there is a tide of change happening in our industry within the accessibility space where I think people are really paying attention. I know I've talked about before how much I love the EMC accessibility report, and I think that's really one of the bigger, like, big signs in the ground that say, hey, this is what needs to change and this is how we're changing it. And I think that that is so important, but it's not enough.
Build off of that. Do you think perhaps actually there's a lot of just lack of enforcement and that's a huge problem?
Yes, I have been asked before, well, when was email marketing in any of these accessibility lawsuits? And the truth is it's there, but it's always there as a rider in a more bigger part of the lawsuits, right? That I was kind of thrilled to see, I think, with the Domino's lawsuit actually had email in there as being a problem. But I don't think we're going to have a lawsuit that's just focused on email marketing for some time. Like I do think that something that kind of cohesively, as we kind of build up these standards, it will be easier to draw out and find the bad players within our industry.
For sure. It's just so fascinating to me because essentially everything to do with accessibility or lack thereof, it just makes your disabled users invisible and they never become the priority. And I'm curious from your perspective, as you're consulting clients, like, is the actual answer hiring a specialist to run that audit and fix the template? Or sometimes it's just allowing them to skate by the status quo?
I do think that there's a certain amount of defensive auditing that companies can do where, if I'm presented with, or, if I'm a company and I'm getting sued for accessibility and I can pull open my drawer and say, I've had these audits done and we're good. Or, at least being able to show we have been working on this. This is how we've solved that problem, I think makes that lawsuit a little bit more defensible. And that definitely exists. I don't think it's a good solution, but I do think, at least for me personally in the audits that I've done, the end result is usually clients who have changed their mind about what they thought accessibility was at the beginning of the call, and clients that are excited about trying to meet those failures and work towards solutions. I do think that like in all things, I think there's just a certain level of entropy that happens when you're doing something at scale. And I definitely,
sure.
one of the things that I do suggest to audit clients is like, okay, so we have this plan. Let's bake in some check-ins at 3 months, at 6 months, so that we can kind of make sure that we're plugging in any of the holes where things are falling off. And then I'm looking at those Black Friday, middle of the night edits, where the alt text isn't updated, and we can be like, okay, well, here's a problem. How can we build in a solution to solve it? Is the clients that are running things through accessibility checkers and feeling like they've got a green flag, and so they never have to think about it again.
Right.
Even though I'm forever pointing out, like, that's not everything. You still need a human. So there's always going to be, I think, a natural inherent conflict within the auditing process. And I do my best to kind of pre-resolve that and kind of work to make sure that that's not just something that's in our drawers so that we can prove that we tried,
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of all the different forced trainings, and when you're on board at any certain company, like, well, we checked the box, we did it. Everyone was informed of X, Y, and Z, and it feels like an excuse and really like, let's cover our tracks so that we're fine. But instead, it's actually the individual that's the problem, which oftentimes it can be. However, it's also systemic that we're blaming an individual versus the broader company.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's kind of a lot of what I do try to kind of get us back to. Like, it isn't a lot of what I say in my audits is like, it's not one person's job to do accessibility. When we're going through these audits, I'm not just talking to a developer. I want to talk to everyone on the team, because if the design gets to the developer and no one's checked the color contrast, that's not the developer's fault, and kind of making sure that this is an everyone problem, not the guy at the end of the road problem.
For sure. It almost sounds like we need to have dedicated email guides for accessibility on top of what exists for web, because it is a different medium. We are a little bit stuck in the 90s versus what web can do. And to your point earlier, we actually can't even fully abide by the rules in email based off of how the technology exists today.
Yes and no, but I do like that has actually been a lot of my push lately. Stitch is actually creating some of this documentation so that we can send to clients kind of as parting gifts with an audit, even if they don't do like a full big audit, of being able to say, hey, notice that your heading order isn't quite right. So here is a PDF on, the best way to do that in Braze and kind of what success looks like, so that they can at least have a guide. I really think most ESPs should have really good documentation about how to make their content accessible, especially when we're talking about some of these drag and drop editors that everybody's using, but nobody really knows how to use. There's definitely gaps there that we can fill. Whether or not anyone ever looks at those documents, completely different problem. But like, having it available to people, I think, would be huge.
Without a doubt. To begin to close us out, what's the hardest thing about this moment in email accessibility that you don't often say out loud?
I kind of hate saying it out loud, actually, is that there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of recycled content where, like, I totally get it. And especially since as accessibility continues to build momentum in our industry, I think there's a lot of pressure from individual companies and organizations within our industry to produce accessibility content. And so I think a lot of stuff just keeps getting recycled. And like, I did it too. I championed bulletproof buttons as an accessible solution in like my very first accessibility talk. And that was totally wrong because I didn't do the work to find out if that was right or not. So I think there is just kind of a lot of stuff that gets regurgitated without anyone thinking about it. And that has consequences. And I think the natural consequence is that enough people listen to it and then they implement it in their solutions, and then it doesn't really actually work and causes a lot of dumb problems for users.
Agreed. That's why I'm bringing on the experts, because I'm sick of the misinformation and
me too.
And the false myths that we all deem true. And I know a fair amount about accessibility, but it's the same for me with deliverability. I know when it requires a professional versus I'm well-versed, but not the expert.
Exactly. We all have to have understanding and limits. No one can be the jack of all trades in email and marketing anymore. It just can't happen. You can't know everything. So
that's true.
I completely agree.
Okay. Sarah, you are proof that most powerful advocates are those who combine deep technical knowledge with a personal stake in the outcome. And the accessibility revolution will not come from just compliance departments. It'll come from the people who refuse to accept that 27% of customers or an optional audience and segment. And so before I let you go, who is someone we should have on the podcast?
Oh my gosh. And there's so many good ones. There's two women that I know I personally have counted on for their deep, expansive knowledge and just historical understanding of our industry. And that would be Karina Cohen and Jenna Matson. They are like Salesforce deep divers. Like they just know everything.
That's awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Where can folks find you?
Well, you can always find me on LinkedIn and then also my blog, which is a11y.email, which has all things email accessibility on it. So thank you.
Awesome. We have covered a lot of ground today, and the uncomfortable truth is most of this is fixable. Here is where to start with some listener takeaways. Number one, only 0.1% of HTML emails meet accessibility standards, which means having accessibility baked into your process, you're already at 99.9% of the competition. Instantly, 28% of US adults have a disability, which means you're not just designing for a niche, you're ignoring your largest untapped segment. So start with live text and alt text on linked images. Those are just two very quick fixes without a specialist required, and it is better than most inboxes overnight. But if you want to take it to that next level, highly recommend thinking through contrast and potentially even getting an accessibility audit. Next, AI can only check 20 to 40% of WCAG criteria, which means a green accessibility score doesn't mean your email is accessible. It means a robot checked what a robot can check. The remaining requires a human to review 60 to 80%. And also that means the automated score is a floor, not a finish line. So build human auditing into the design stage before the email ever reaches your developer. And lastly, accessibility is not one person's job. And that means if color contrasts fail in production, that's a process failure, not a developer failure. Most ESPs don't document how to build accessibility into their platforms, which means the knowledge gap is systemic and it's not singular to an individual. So audit your process aggressively as you build your templates. Where does your accessibility get checked? By whom and at what stage? Thank you for tuning in to the Making Sense of MarTech. See you next time. A special thank you to Christine Murtaugh, who edited this episode, and an extra special thank you to Jenna Carter for believing in a passion project meets business. Stay curious.